Hey everybody, welcome to our first video for Human Resource Management. We've already done week 1, so we already talked about an introduction. As I said, there was no video to watch for that, and now we're talking about the second lesson. So, I don't want to make a video that has all the information and then we just go back through it again during the Zoom tutorial. That's kind of a waste of your time. But I also understand, balancing that idea that I don't want to waste your time also is the fact that I need to make sure in these online classes that you really are getting the information. And so there is some benefit to repeating certain ideas because, we're not face-to-face in a room. It's hard for me to know if you really get it. So what I'm going to try to do is keep these videos shorter. I don't want to make a 3-hour video that you need to watch. I think reading the textbook is really important. Again, I want you to read these chapters, right, from the Diane Arthur book, the American Management Association. So this one is chapter 2, if you can see it, chapter 2. And that is management and legal issues. So that's the chapter I want you to read for our coming class, which will be the one this video is for. And then let's walk through this PPT, and I'll go into some depth on the things that I think are difficult and important to know. I'll tell you what you really need to get ready and what you need to prepare for. And then some of the things, the activities, I'm currently scanning things and making sure that we can do that stuff together. Okay, so let's jump right in. So what we're talking about in this chapter is equal opportunity, diversity, but really we're talking about the law. That's right at the beginning of HR. We have to understand that in HR, we're dealing with a lot of legal situations, whether it's sexual harassment or discrimination or a claim of equal pay where a woman is not paid as much as a man. Equal pay, by the way, is a woman is not paid as much as a man. There's no claim for a man who's not paid as much as a woman because it doesn't happen so much. And there are a variety of laws that we need to understand in HR that protect different groups of people. So that's kind of what we need to understand today. What are the equal employment laws? How this affects HR? What is discrimination law? How do we defend against that? What can an employer do during some of these employment processes? And so we're going to do a little values and ethics activity. We'll do that during class. We'll have our group presentation during class. We'll do card cleaning company during class. And we'll do this discussion during class. And we can kind of start by talking about this case, Gruszewski versus Hooters. So Hooters, if you don't know, is an American restaurant famous for chicken wings and for having waitresses who have a large chest, and it's called Hooters. And in 2009, there was a guy named Nikolai Gruszewski, and he sued Hooters because they would not hire him because he was a man, and they only hired women who looked sexy and had a large chest. And, and he said in his complaint, in his legal case, that Hooters merely wishes to exploit female sexuality as a marketing tool to attract customers. Of course, there's no question that is true, but he was, one of the first people to try to sue Hooters based on this. Hooters argued something called a BFOQ. We're going to learn about that, and that's an important defense. And they said that the essence of their business is that they're not really a restaurant so much as they are a place for these sexy women to work, almost like a modeling agency, and that their whole business model would not work if they were forced to hire men. Now, this isn't a very good argument for Hooters, but it was their argument. And what they said is, quote, "If we lose this go-around, this court case, you can next expect hairy-legged guys in the Rockettes to line up and male models in the Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue." And their point is, what we do is market and exploit female sexuality, and that's okay. That's their point, is that that's okay. Now, in fact, they decided not to go to court. They settled for $3.75 million in 1997 for a very similar case. And what they said in this settlement is they can continue just hiring women, but they'll create a few other support jobs for men, like bartender or maitre d' or things like that. And Hooters made an official statement, and their statement was, "We're proud of who we are. Yes, we have a pretty face, and sex appeal is part of our thing, but it's not the only thing. There will always be those out there looking to take a shot at us or have the government dictate what we can or can't do, but we'll just take it in stride and continue our quest to provide a fun, enlightened atmosphere where you can enjoy the finer things in life. And anyway, what's so offensive about an owl?" That's their mascot is an owl because he has two big round eyes. So the point here that we're making is, can the government make a decision about who you can and who you can't hire? And we'll talk about this a little in class because it is important, I think, to discuss this idea. But the question of discrimination is a very interesting question. These days in the world, the word discrimination definitely has a meaning, an implied meaning, that it is always wrong. It's always wrong to discriminate, and discrimination is a bad thing. But that's not really what the word means when we talk about HR, and that's really what we need to understand, a big part of the lesson today. Let's say that I am making a television show. Okay, I'm a producer making a television show, and I'm looking for an actor who is 14 years old. He's supposed to be just starting high school. And Rodrigo comes and applies for the job. Now, Rodrigo doesn't look like he's starting high school, or Jonathan applies for the job. He doesn't look like he's starting high school. Somebody a little bit older. Can I say, no, I'm sorry, we're not going to take you? Could they sue me because I refused to give them the role? What if a girl wanted the part of this boy actor? Am I discriminating? Sure. That's age discrimination. Absolutely. Is it okay? Yeah, of course. I mean, you can't tell me that in a movie they should allow, if they have a part that's meant for a beautiful woman, that you should allow a man to play that. The part is for a beautiful woman, and if you have a part for a man, now this is an extreme example, but think of another example. If you have a school that is a Christian school or any religious academy, and they strongly believe in the teachings of their religion and their faith and their church or temple, and part of what they teach is their religious background and their doctrine, and I, not religious at all, and I apply for the job, can they refuse to give me the job? Sure. Because it wouldn't make sense for me to work there. For the same reason that I'm not going to get a job at an all-girls school as the director of the dormitory. It's just not in their interest to get, there's nothing wrong with discrimination in some cases. What we need to understand in HR is, what are those cases? Where is it okay to discriminate? What if I have two people working for me? I have a guy and a girl, and the guy has worked for me. Oh, I should get your attendance list. Then I would have some names to play with. I have a guy who works for me. He's worked for me for 10 years. And a girl, she just started 6 months ago. And I have a great new assignment. They're going to make a lot of money, and it's in Thailand, and beautiful 5-star resort. And I send the guy. And the girl sues me for discrimination. She says that was gender discrimination. Well, I sent the guy because he has 10 years experience. That makes sense, right? That's totally legitimate. Is it discrimination? Yeah. Discrimination just means choosing one thing over another. You could say, I'm a discriminating coffee drinker. I only drink the best coffee. I'm a discriminating pizza eater. I'm a discriminating wine taster. Discriminating by itself is not a bad word. In HR, we have to accept that part of our job is understanding the nature of discrimination. And part of that involves a variety of different laws. So we're really going to look at 7 laws. Here are the first 4. We'll look first at an earlier law from the late 1800s. Then we'll get into the 60s, which is a time in America when a lot of these laws were created. We'll go into the 70s with things like vocational rehabilitation, the Pregnancy Act, and then we'll go towards the 90s, and then we'll do a final one, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act. Here's a discussion. We can do that in class, but let's start with, oh, I can't go backwards in this slideshow. Okay, well, either way, we'll discuss it in class, but the first one I wanted to say was the Civil Rights Act 1866. Okay, so the Civil Rights Act 1866. And that obviously is a very old law, but it says that you cannot use race or national origin, where somebody is from. Of course, this law was more aspirational than real, more theoretical. This was a law, but not everybody was really following it. There was still, of course, a tremendous amount of discrimination in America. Look, there still is. You know, this fight is still being fought on a daily basis in this country. And with luck and persistence, there will be greater equality for all in the years to come. What can I say except I support the fight and equality and will do my part, which is what I can do is to vote, to be a good teacher, and to try to be a good employer when I have my own employees, and to try to foster understanding. There's really nothing else I can do as a citizen. But I can help you guys to understand the background and history of things like discrimination. So in 1866, one of the things the court made so clear that was very important was the difference between disparate treatment and disparate impact. Disparate means different. So they said there's a difference between when two people are treated differently and when there's an impact. And we do need to understand that. Even though this is from 1866, this is still the law today, along with this thing on the bottom, the bona fide occupational qualification, the BFOQ. Remember, I just said that's what Hooters argued. So even though this is from 1866, this is the law today. So disparate treatment is what you probably think of as discrimination, right? Saying I'm not going to hire someone from this country. I will not hire white people. I will not hire women. I will not hire anybody who's short. I will not hire fat people. Anything like that. Just clear discrimination. That's disparate treatment. Disparate impact, however, is a little different. That's when you didn't discriminate on purpose, but there was an impact. Let's say that I'm hiring people to work in my English school, and all of you guys come and you apply for a job in my English school, and I give you a test. And this test is written entirely in Chinese. And obviously, Chinese people pass the test because they can read it, and most of you guys, if not all of you guys, fail the test. Did I intend to discriminate? Maybe not. What if the test was in very difficult English? And if you didn't really have higher education, it would be hard to understand these words. And a lot of people failed the test. Am I discriminating? No, maybe not. Maybe I'm just giving a test that I think is important. This is a school in China. I think you should read Chinese. Or this is an English school. I think you should have excellent English. Maybe the test is in French. Maybe I give you a strength test. Whatever it is, I might not be discriminating. I might not be trying to say I won't hire women, I won't hire white people, I won't hire tall people. I'm not trying to discriminate. I'm making a test that is fair for everybody. But what if no white people pass that test? Is there an impact on the white people? Sure. What if no Chinese people pass? There's an impact. What if I have a test that is a strength test and fewer women pass? There's an impact on them. It doesn't matter if the employer did this intentionally. All that matters is there was an impact. An example of this is word of mouth advertising. So imagine that I work at a company where pretty much everybody's white. Just happened. That's just the way the company is. And we're looking for some new salespeople. Very good job. And we don't put out any advertisements on the internet or in newspapers or trade journals or anything. All of our advertising, all of our referrals, our recruitment is just word of mouth. I tell all of my white salesmen to please go tell anybody you know, your friends, and if they want a job. And well, guess what? Most of the people who apply for the job are white. Did I discriminate on purpose? No. Do I have anything against having a black applicant or having an Asian applicant? No, of course not. No problem at all. But the way I did this recruitment impacted people of color negatively. Is that discrimination? Yes. Is it disparate treatment? No. I was not trying to treat people differently, but it's still disparate impact. We'll talk about this more in class because this is one of those key ideas you really do need to know. Also, you really do need to know this BFOQ, bona fide occupational qualification. And we'll come back to this again later in the PPT. But what this means is, as I said, sometimes it's bona fide or bona fide, which means in good faith that you can discriminate. And I gave two examples here. In a women's, my face is blocking it, in a women's bathroom. That's the word. In a women's bathroom, I work in a restaurant, very, very expensive, 5-star Michelin restaurant. And in the bathrooms, we have an attendant, somebody who stands there and gives you a towel and turns on the water for you, whatever. Can I hire a man to work in the women's bathroom? No. Am I discriminating against men? Yeah. Can I hire a woman to work in the man's bathroom? No. Is that discrimination? Yeah. Is that okay? Yeah. It's in good faith. I'm not trying to say I don't like women. They don't belong in the men's bathroom. And maybe you can argue that point, but for this point, we'll say they don't. And a man doesn't belong in a woman's bathroom. I don't think anybody's going to argue that point. So yes, that's discrimination, and yes, it's okay. What about the next example that I gave before, hiring a Christian teacher to work in a Christian school? Is that okay? Yeah. Is that discrimination? Sure, of course. But if they want to teach things that come from their scriptural and religious background, they want to teach the creationist opinion of how the world came to be, why would they hire someone who doesn't believe that or isn't going to teach that? Of course. Is it discrimination? Yes. Is it okay? Yes. Sometimes discrimination is okay. But understand that's because these days the word discrimination has a very negative connotation. And maybe it should, but it doesn't. That's not really what it means for us in HR. Okay, jumping forward quite a few years, we get to the next law, which was in the late 1930s, which was the FLSA. The FLSA really started when there were a lot more factories in America. This is after the Industrial Revolution, after World War I. You're having a lot of people who are working in factories who've come into the cities. And the problem was, and we don't talk about this a lot in HR, the background of these laws. In fact, we talk about that more in my business law class. But during that period of time, workers just had no power. And the bosses had all the power, the factory owners. And so the courts started making some rules to protect workers. And the first one was the FLSA, which established minimum wages. And it said, you cannot pay people nothing per hour. You really have to have a minimum wage. You can't work them 80 hours a week. You have to have a maximum number of hours. Beyond that, you have to pay overtime. And it also established these two ideas of exempt and non-exempt. Ooh, I have a highlighter. Let's see. Exempt and non-exempt. And I need you to know these words. So in English, exempt means you're not part of something. So if I say you're exempt from the test, you do not have to take the test. If you're exempt from class, you do not have to come to class. Exempt means you do not have to do something. I, for example, am a lawyer, and I am exempt from the FLSA. Why? This law does not apply to me, or as a teacher. The FLSA would not apply to me. As a university teacher, I should say that. As a primary teacher, it would. Why? Why would it not apply to a lawyer? Well, I wrote on the bottom here, executives, administrative, professionals, sales. These people are exempt. The law does not apply to them. So this law says you have to have a minimum wage. Have you ever heard of a lawyer or a doctor having to worry about being paid less than the minimum wage? Is that something lawyers worry about? What about maximum hours? Can a lawyer work 100 hours a week? Sure. You know why? Because they make a lot of money if they do that. These laws are meant to protect the people who are non-exempt. It's meant to protect people who are hourly workers, laborers, blue collar, say it however you want, people who work in factories, people who work in fast food restaurants, people who work in chain retail stores, people who are getting paid by the hour. They need to be protected a little bit more. Where you don't need to protect professors and doctors and lawyers and architects. If they want to work 100 hours, let them. They're going to earn a lot of money. It's not going to be a problem. So non-exempt really means pretty much everybody who is an hourly kind of normal laborer. They have to follow, or I should say their employers have to follow the FLSA. Now let's jump forward. And again, I'm going to go through these a little bit quickly if I can. I'd like to keep this lecture to around an hour, between an hour and 90 minutes. And then we'll, talk about it a little more in class if you don't understand. Equal pay, and I said this at the beginning of the class, only applies to women. Because, in all honesty, women are paid less than men, and men are not paid less than women. And so we don't need a law for the men. And the Equal Pay Act is just about women. Okay, doesn't say that that races need to be equal or that people with a disability need to be equal. Those are different laws that we'll look at. This Equal Pay Act, 1963, one of the first pieces of legislation to protect workers, was about men and women, saying that women need to be paid an equal amount. However, the job must involve either equal work or comparable work. And these are words that are going to come back when we talk about compensation and paying people. So what is equal work? It doesn't mean the same job. So let's say if you compare my job, teaching, to Eiling's job. Eiling is the director of CIP. Her job is higher status than mine. She is my boss. Does her job and my job have equivalent responsibility? No. Her job has more responsibility. I am responsible for you guys, my students. She is responsible for all the teachers. Are there similar working conditions? Sort of, not really. I go to class, she's in an office. Do we have similar efforts or skills? Maybe. But we don't do equal work. What about me and Cecilia, who teaches English and writing? Do we have equal skill, effort? We have similar working conditions, certainly. We have similar responsibilities, certainly. She's not qualified to teach law, which I'm qualified to teach. I could teach English, although I don't have her background in it. Is it exactly equal? This is what we discuss in HR. I don't know what anybody's salary is in CIP, so I have no idea if I earn more or less. I would assume I earn the same thing. But differences in pay are okay. They do not violate the act if it's based on something reasonable. It could be seniority, which means Cecilia's been, and she has been at the school for like 12 years or something. 7 years, I don't know, some long time. I haven't. I've been at the school for 4 years, so she should make more. Merit. What if every year she won Teacher of the Year award? Well, then she should get more money. Or any other system that measures quantity or measures quality. What if she's teaching a class of 65 kids and I'm teaching a class of 5? Should she make more? Probably. So it's possible that she or I would make more. It's possible that the man would make more money. Certainly, I would expect Anselm to make more money. He's been at the school longer. He has more seniority. I don't know anything else, but I don't know if he has yeah, that's all I know. You think of John Wilson. He has a PhD. He's a doctor. So, and I'm a doctor of law. I have a Juris Doctor, but that's different from a PhD. All of these differences matter. Now, you might not be equal with somebody else. You might just be comparable. Comparable worth is a super important idea in HR that we're going to get deep into when we talk about money and compensation much later in this semester. Because in HR, one of the things you have to deal with is a worker coming to the office and saying, hey, I think it's not fair. I found out that Chandra makes more money than me and I want to know why. Or Crystal makes more money than Chandra and Chandra's angry. And this is something that we need to deal with. And in HR, we certainly can't say, well, I mean, she's better than you. You can't say something like that. Or, she's worth more. Or you have to be able to give something quantifiable, something numerical, something with numbers. And so every person in a company has an economic value. How do we determine that is something we'll talk about later. The next law is maybe the most important one, Title VII. We just call it Title VII. Title VII was a critical law. This was one of the centerpieces of the civil rights movement in the 1960s in America. And what this law said is that employers can't discriminate. We're not including BFOQ. BFOQ is always legitimate. You do not have to hire a man to work in a women's bathroom. You can always do that. But nobody can discriminate based on race, color, religion, gender, origin, anything. Eye color, hair color, height, weight, age, pretty much anything. And it was really focused on race and color and religion, right? That was the real big focus. Because it was the 1960s, it was an end to segregation. And this law affected any business that had more than 15 employees. What happens if a business only had 2 employees or 3 employees? That gets into law. So if you work in a company that only has 2 people in it, let's say, I actually know someone who worked in China. It was a woman who worked in China and she was pregnant and she was an English teacher and her company fired her. And she said, why are you firing me? And they said, you're pregnant. And it's like, oh my God, you can't do that. I mean, we'll learn a law about that in a few minutes, but I don't think you need a law to know that you can't just say, oh, you're pregnant, you're fired. That you really can't do that. That's very clear discrimination. And they're not covered by Title VII. Even if they were in America, they wouldn't be covered. Could this pregnant woman still sue the company? Of course she could. There are plenty of ways to sue a company. She just couldn't use Title VII. Title VII is a law, and you can sue some company using Title VII using what's called the EEOC, which we'll learn. And throughout this semester, we'll actually learn how to do that because I think it's important that you know. But so any business that has more than 15 employees is covered by Title VII. It doesn't regulate companies that employ citizens outside America, so it wouldn't work in China. You need to prove disparate impact, but you do not have to prove disparate treatment. You just have to prove that there was something in the company, whether it was an English test or a strength test or whatever it was, that impacted a protected group of people. And when I say protected group, I mean any individual group, whites, blacks, Asians, Christians, short people, people with glasses, people with brown eyes, Muslims, any group, any individual group is called a protected class. These classes are protected. You can't discriminate against any class. And as I said, the way that you use Title VII is through something called the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. This is a 5-member commission. It's appointed by the president. It's a big thing in America. People have a 5-year term. They have thousands and thousands of employees. Now, let's say that I was working at a company in America and they had more than 15 employees, and I felt I was discriminated against. I didn't get a promotion, and the guy who got it was whatever, Christian, and I'm not Christian. And it turns out that all of the people in the higher management, the vice presidents, the highest senior managers, they're all Christians. And I think there's discrimination here. I'm going to go to the EEOC's website, I'm going to fill out a form, and their job is to investigate. I don't have to pay them. They'll do this for free. They're going to investigate. If they find that there is discrimination, they're going to talk to the boss. And this is anonymous. Nobody knows that I did it. The boss doesn't know. And they will try to negotiate some sort of settlement. If there is no settlement, the EEOC will sue the company and take them to court. So this is a really powerful, these are the teeth. We say the teeth of this law, because a law with no teeth, it's not really a law. Okay, next law is the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, that's 1967. And this was not just about age discrimination. This was particularly to protect older people, people over 40. And the idea was that there was a lot of discrimination, especially after World War II, when a lot of people came back. As they got older, they found that there were more jobs for young people who hadn't gone to war, who had gone to university, and the older people were having trouble getting jobs. And so they created this law. This effectively ended mandatory retirement. You can't tell somebody they must retire at age 50 or 55 or 60. This law protects against that. It also protects against discrimination where one person is younger as long as they're still within the protected age group. So imagine that I work for a company and I'm 45 and there's another person who's 55. And the person who's 55 did not get the promotion and I got it. And they say it's because of their age. And I say, well, you can't use this law because we're both over 40. They can still use this law. So this is for private sector employees, employers with more than 20 people. Again, if you have under 20 people, you can certainly sue a company. You just can't use this law to sue them. Next is OSHA. OSHA is a very important law made in 1970. All of these standards of health and regulations and safety around America are all OSHA standards. OSHA is huge, their organization. And it gives all kinds of standards, whether it's you need to have security doors, you need to have exits that are clearly marked. If the floor is wet, you need to put out some sort of sign. If you're working with any dangerous chemicals or materials, you need to have stations to wash your eyes. You need to wear certain kind of protective clothing or gear, goggles, or anything. Anything related to health and safety really falls under OSHA. The next thing to talk about is this discussion that we'll talk about together in class, but it leads us to an idea of affirmative action, which is something I need you to know. And affirmative action is about making an effort to hire people in, and here's the word I said again, protected groups, especially in underrepresented groups. So what are some groups that are underrepresented? We'll talk about that in class a little bit, but let's say, for example, that let's say at CIP. Now, CIP is under Chinese law, not American law, and Chinese law doesn't necessarily have affirmative action principles, but for the sake of this example, let's say we're at CIP and they need a new teacher, a new English teacher, and two people apply for the job, somebody who's black and somebody who's white. Now, let's say these people are pretty much equal in terms of their background, their experience, their education, their salary requirements. Everything's pretty much equal. But maybe the white applicant went to a little bit better school or had a little bit more experience. If CIP chose the black applicant, that would be in order to promote a more diverse culture. Now, actually, one of the great things about CIP is how diverse it is. So this is actually a bad example. A better example would be a school in America where most of the professors are white. Now, if they chose to hire a black candidate rather than a white candidate, that would be protected under affirmative action. The white person might try to sue them and say, listen, this is discrimination. Look at this guy and look at me. I went to a better school. I had more experience. I had a better background, whatever. But the fact is, sometimes it is important to help underrepresented groups. I'll give an example in China, actually. I hope you guys are familiar with the Gaokao, which is the equivalent of the SATs, the college entrance exam in China. If you don't know it, you should, the Gaokao. So if you're from a smaller village or town, for example, Yunnan. If you're from the mountains of Yunnan, not Shanghai or Beijing or Shenzhen, but Yunnan, you automatically start the Gaokao with a higher grade. You just start with a higher score. And a lot of people in China have argued and brought court cases to say that's unfair. And what the court has said is, listen, in Shanghai and Beijing, you guys have computers everywhere. You have all of these great facilities. You have teachers. There's money around. There's after-school schools. There's bushi bands. There's all these opportunities to learn, not to mention that you're growing up in a big city surrounded by information and newspapers. If you're growing up in the mountains of Yunnan, you really don't have those opportunities. Maybe they should start out with a higher grade just to equal things out. Is this discrimination? Absolutely. This is reverse discrimination. Still discrimination. Is it okay? Let's talk about that in class. Next is the Vocational Rehabilitation Act. And when we talk about rehabilitation, we're talking about disabilities. This was the first law that really talked about disability in 1973. And again, it talked about affirmative action for disabled people. Now, it became clear in the early 70s as the courts and the legislation, the Congress, the government were trying to equalize people at work, women, men, people of color, people, different minorities, people with different backgrounds and religions. It became clear that people who have disabilities, blind, missing an arm or a leg, deaf, mute, and then later on, emotional disabilities we'll talk about in a minute. But right now we're talking about physical disabilities, people in wheelchairs. There was so much discrimination against them. Now, again, when I say discrimination, I don't mean people hated them. I don't mean there was anger against people in wheelchairs or people who were blind. They just weren't getting jobs. There was this idea that a blind person just couldn't do the job, or that a person in a wheelchair just couldn't do the job as well. So this law made two important ideas. One is about this idea of accommodation, and the other is this idea of undue hardship. So accommodation says a business or a company has to take every step they can to make it accessible for somebody who is disabled. We don't really use the word handicapped anymore, but disabled. So if someone with a wheelchair wants to work there and the company they have the opportunity, they must put in a ramp in the front. They can't just have stairs. They must make this accommodation. There are cases where for people who are blind or deaf, there need to be either a system of Braille, which is the system where blind people can read with their fingertips, feeling bumps on something. There, for deaf people, might be a color-oriented system. Now, this has gone farther. Now there are people who argue that if they are obese and very overweight, doorways should be opened. Certainly doorways need to be opened for people in wheelchairs. Now, what if CIP had the opportunity to hire somebody in a wheelchair? And that would be great. You know, that would give us even more diversity, and I'm a big fan of diversity. The best way to get over any discrimination that people have is to get to know somebody in those protected classes and realize they're just a person. So it would be great. But would it be an undue hardship for CIP to put in ramps in every building? What about Donghua? To put in ramps for every building in the entire campus, to open and widen almost every doorway in the campus? They couldn't. It would bankrupt them. It would be much too much money. That's an undue hardship. A company needs to make accommodations for disabled people unless doing that, and here's the legal battle, is, you know, on one side you have somebody who's disabled who's suing the company saying, you need to make accommodations for me. And on the other side you have the company saying, we can't make all these changes. It's just not, it's not economically reasonable or feasible for us to do that. Next is the Pregnancy Discrimination Act. This focused on not only pregnancy, but it said something very interesting, which I think we can go into in class. It said that pregnancy and childbirth are a disability. Now, this is interesting because we have this opinion of the word disabled. And I'm sure that when I say pregnancy is a disability, what a lot of people think is, well, that's not true because disability means something bad. And that's very important to recognize. No, it doesn't. Being in a wheelchair is a disability. Being blind is a disability. It's not bad. That's just a correlation that people have made in language, that being disabled equals being less than. But it's not. It just means that there is, in the language of HR, something that impairs your daily activities. Does childbirth or pregnancy affect your daily activities, your ability to walk far, your ability to stand for a long time, your ability to focus? Of course, absolutely. If you can't stand for a long time, you can't walk, maybe you have morning sickness and you're getting sick, it affects people who are pregnant might be very sensitive around certain smells and odors and tastes, and all of these things could be considered disabilities. And so this was a new law that kind of treated pregnancy as that. I don't think we need to talk about this, the Uniform Guidelines on Employee Selection. So I'll skip over that just to let you know what it is. In America, the government, in the late 70s, they started to realize, well, we have a problem. Every different department, the Department of Defense, the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of the Post Office, the Department of the Interior, the Department of National Parks, all of these departments were using different guidelines to do HR. And so the federal government created new guidelines that are just for all departments. We don't need to go into that. Moot court is an activity we'll do together in class, so I'm just going to skip right through that. Executive orders, I don't really care about that either. Same idea, just federal American government things, government laws that were made, and this was a focus on contractors. And contractors are people who are hired by the government. Let's say the American government has a crazy idea to build a wall around between America and Mexico. What a crazy idea. They are going to hire people to do that. They're going to hire companies. That company is a contractor. And originally, these laws didn't always affect government-hired companies. So in 1977, there was an executive order that said all of these laws affect contractors, anybody hired by the government as well. The next law I'd like to discuss is the ADA. ADA, American with Disabilities Act, is a very important law. It really expanded this concept of disability. We already talked about the idea of an accommodation. We already talked about the employer defenses, which is saying there's an undue hardship. But now I'd like to talk about who's qualified. Before, when I said disability, I talked about somebody who might be blind or deaf or mute or missing a limb or in a wheelchair, something physical. And the ADA says, still, you need to make accommodations unless there's an undue hardship. But now here's the big change. Instead of saying disability, they said it affects anybody with an impairment. And an impairment could be physiological, that's physical, and that now includes something like disfigurement. Imagine if somebody was in a fire and their face is burned. They are now considered, they're not disabled, right? There's no disability, they're not missing any part of their body, but they're impaired. We have to just recognize those people are treated differently. People with skin conditions, even if they have all their limbs and they can walk and they can talk and they can see and hear, there still might be other physical impairments. It doesn't define specifically what is every disability, but it's anything that substantially limits one or more major life activities. It could be physical and it could be mental. And this was huge because now this includes things like depression, ADD, ADHD, attention deficit disorder. It includes hypersomnia. It includes anxiety disorders. It includes panic attacks. It includes all kinds of personality disorders, things that previously were not seen at all as disabilities. Disability was purely physical. And this law moved it over into this idea of, does it limit your major life activities? We do that discussion in class. So what is a reasonable accommodation? I said before, it could be putting in a ramp instead of stairs. It could be getting equipment or other devices that would allow a blind person or a deaf person to do the job, whether it's answering phones or identifying different offices to go into, or all of these things. It might include totally redesigning the job, modifying a work schedule. What if I have a disability where I get very, very anxious in the early morning? I just get very, very anxious. I have panic attacks anytime before noon. Maybe as a reasonable accommodation, if I am suitable for this job at a university, they might need to change my schedule so I don't work in the morning. Now, of course, I need a doctor to provide evidence that this is true. I can't just say it, but this is a major life activity that it impairs, and that is legitimate. We have a couple slides on how to provide these accommodations, such as the use of voice recognition software for people who might be blind or have vision impairments. Word prediction software for people who really can't use their hands and they can only type 1 or 2 letters. That could help them. Translation software for people to participate in meetings if they can't speak well. Vibrating phones or text messages. There's disability-friendly websites. And here are some ADA guidelines about, one of the things that's important is not letting someone who's disabled have misconduct or erratic performance. It is the case that with disability, sometimes, for example, if, let's say I have a job teaching and there's another teacher who's blind. If we do the same level job, in a lot of companies, the blind person tends to get a better performance review. Because like I said, there's this idea that disability is a bad thing, and so that someone who has a disability was able to do it at the same level as someone who does not have a disability is seen as more impressive. Where I would say, well, what's the difference? But there is a difference. I mean, I can see you guys, I can read the PPTs, but somebody who's been blind, maybe since birth or for a very long time, they have absolutely learned to adjust and to read and do things in their own way, I assume. And so, I don't know. But, the point of the ADA is be careful we don't give too much leeway to someone just because they have a disability. They're no different from anybody else. The next law is the Civil Rights Act of 1991. This increased protection. So we already had a bunch of different laws that protected groups, most notably and importantly Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. The 1991 Act, the idea is it gave it teeth. It made it stronger. So, as we said before, you just have to show that there was some sort of employment practice, for example, a test, that had a disparate impact on a certain group. It could be that there was no women were getting hired, not because we didn't want women, just because we gave this test and all of the questions were about fixing cars. And, I know that sounds silly, but there's actually a case very similar to that where I think it was the 1970s in Washington, D.C. in America, a group of black people had argued that nobody was passing the police examination. Almost all the people who passed were white. Now, the police department was not trying to do that, it turns out. They had created a test, and the test was written by white people, and it turned out a lot of the questions, if you weren't raised in a white community, some of the language in those questions just didn't really make a lot of sense if you weren't from some of these communities, and so black applicants were doing worse on the test. It was not intentional. There was no disparate treatment, but there was disparate impact. It was impacting black applicants. They were not passing the test. So you don't have to show that there's the intent to discriminate. You just have to show that there was some sort of impact. So the plaintiff has to show two things. One, there is a disparity between the people, the class members like women, in the labor pool, people who want the job and the people who are hired. You have to show, there's a big group of women who want this job, they're not getting hired. There's a big group of black people who want this job, they're not getting hired. There's a big group of short people who want this job, they're not getting hired. And then the employer has the burden of proof. If you've taken my law class, you understand what burden of proof means. That means the responsibility. The boss or the employer or the company has the responsibility to prove there was no discrimination. That's very important. This shifts the burden of proof. Under Title VII, if I wanted to prove discrimination, I, David, the employee, had to prove they were discriminating against me because I'm white, or I'm short, or I'm Jewish, or I'm over 40 years old. Or I had to prove that. That's hard. That's hard for me to prove because the company can always say, no, it's not your age. It's this other thing. It's your background. It's your experience. It's your college. It's your employee review forms. It's what they can always give some excuse. The Civil Rights Act shifted that. They said, David, the employee, you don't have to prove anything. The company, now this is dangerous because it means I have the ability to accuse my company of discrimination and they will get investigated by the EEOC and they need to prove one of two things. So we already showed this idea of BFOQ, bona fide occupational qualification, that there are some jobs that I am not qualified for. I'm not qualified to work in a women's bathroom because I'm a man. But they now created in 1991 a separation between those two. And they said there's another thing called business necessity. And a business necessity, this is more what Hooters maybe should have argued. A business necessity, and we're going to even touch on this a little bit later in the course. I wish I could jump forward, but I can't. Business necessity says that there's a business purpose. So let's go back to this example of a school that's Christian hiring a Christian teacher. Now, I'm not a Christian, okay? I'm Jewish. So could this school refuse to hire me? Sure, they could. But originally, the BFOQ had a problem. Let's say they're teaching law. It's a Christian university, they're teaching law. Am I qualified to teach law? Yes. So BFOQ doesn't really work because it's an occupational qualification. Am I qualified? Do I have the ability to stand in a women's bathroom and give them towels? Sure. But there's a business necessity that would stop them from hiring me at a Christian university or at in a women's bathroom. Right? This is not about can you do the job, it's more about should you do the job. If I'm making a movie where I'm looking for a super sexy female lead and a bunch of men apply for the part, do I have to give them the job? No. Now, could they do it? Physically, could they memorize the lines and stand there and say, oh, Mr. Bond, you are so dangerous, I find you so sexy. Could they do it? Sure, they could. Should they? No, they should not. That's not, the movie needs a woman for that role. I can discriminate and hire a woman. So the court separated this idea of could and should into BFOQ and business necessity. More on that later. So it makes it also easier to sue for money damages because now you can sue for compensatory and punitive damages. This would make a lot more sense if you took my business law class. You would understand what these mean. But traditionally under Title VII, you could sue to try to get the job. But the problem is if the company is discriminating against a protected class, why would you want that job? You might want the company to stop discriminating, but you wouldn't necessarily want the job. You couldn't get really money though. Now you could get in 1991 punitive damages, which means punishment, that the court might force the company to pay a lot of money to all the people in the protected class as a punishment to the business for being discriminatory in bad faith. Next law is the FMLA in 1993. And this created some additional rules for people who want to take a leave, take time off of work, for the birth of a child, for an adoption, for a health condition, for somebody in your family who has a health condition. And this allowed employees to take up to 12 weeks for any of these things, but you had to work for 12 months and you had to give 30 days notice. So this just expanded the rights of people. There are statutory rights. We talk about that much more in law class, but there's statutory rights that employees have, and the FMLA expanded those. One last thing to do before we jump to the next part is to talk about pre-employment questions. And that is in an interview, what kind of questions are off limits? What kind of questions can you not ask? And the answer really is anything that's related to these laws. So let's say I'm interviewing people for my English school, and somebody comes to the interview, a woman, somebody from the class, Crystal or Chandra or Chloe or Bella, somebody comes to the interview and I say, oh, so are you married? It's not a good question, but okay. And one of them says yes. And I say, oh, are you thinking of having children? I can't ask that. It doesn't matter if you're going to get pregnant or not. We have laws about that. And for the same reason that I can't discriminate against you once you're my employee, I can't fire you because you got pregnant, I can't discriminate in this pre-employment phase either. I can't say, what age are you thinking of retiring? A common question people used to ask way back in the 40s. So if I give you this job, who's going to take care of your kids at home? You cannot ask questions like that. I can ask you about your ability to do this job. Have you ever taught English before? What makes you think you'd be good at teaching English? Why did you choose my school to teach English? I cannot ask, do you have AIDS? I can ask you if you've committed a felony, but I can't say, have you been to prison? As we get deeper into HR, you could Google this, you'll find, a list of questions you can and can't ask. And once I've offered you a job, if I find out some things based on a medical test, I can't necessarily take back the offer. American Airlines tried to do this where they offered a job to a pilot and then they gave the pilot a medical test, found out the pilot had AIDS, and then tried to take back the offer. And the court said, sorry, you can't. Is AIDS going to stop him from flying an airplane? Because if it is, okay. But if it's not, your job is to hire someone who flies airplanes, right? Anything else is discrimination. Does this disability, which could be pregnancy too, influence somebody's ability to do the job? Does being Muslim, black, Asian, white, tall, short, fat, thin, sometimes it does. Being short will stop you from getting a job on an airplane as a steward or a stewardess because they have to open and close the very high compartments. That's a BFOQ. I am not qualified. I can't do a job that you need to be very tall for. Some jobs can have a strength test. Being a fireman, or fire person, sorry. Being a fire person, you have to carry heavy equipment. We want our fire people to be able to carry this heavy equipment. Can they give a strength test? Yes. Does that discriminate against weak people? Sure. Does it discriminate against somebody who has a physical disability and cannot carry equipment? Sure. But as a society, we want people who can carry that equipment. If the fire department had an alternate method, some sort of machine that could carry the equipment, then would they have to make an accommodation for somebody who was disabled? Maybe. But you can't ask questions that are related to any of these discriminatory protection laws that we've talked about. Okay, that gets us to our next part, which is about defenses. And we've pretty much talked about this already. So there's not too much left. I think we can continue. We'll get through this pretty fast. So the defenses we've talked about already. First, let's go back and make sure we understand this adverse impact idea, the difference between adverse treatment and adverse impact, or disparate. I use the word disparate before. Adverse is the same idea. So the difference between disparate treatment and disparate impact. Remember that disparate treatment is discrimination, formal, we don't hire Jewish people. We don't hire women. We don't hire anybody under 6 feet tall. We don't hire anybody over the age of 40. That's clear discrimination. And if they don't have a good BFOQ or business necessity, you can't do that. Adverse impact is when there's no clear discrimination. There's just a neutral practice, like a test, but it does impact a group of people. And if you've been the victim of some sort of impactful practice, something that impacted you, you only have to present a prima facie case, again, a legal idea. A prima facie case is a case at first sight where I might say, you know, I have here a list of 25 Jewish people who've applied for this job, and none of them have been hired, but they've already hired 5 new teachers. So I have a list of 25 Jewish people who applied for a job at this school, and they didn't hire any of those Jewish people, but they did hire 5 new teachers who are not Jewish. Do I know that they're discriminating against Jewish people? No, I don't know that. Doesn't matter. I made a case. And at first sight, there might be discrimination. All I need to show is the 4/5 rule, which says if 80% of a group of people passed and 20% didn't, that's some kind of discrimination. So for example, using the number 100, just to make the numbers easy, if I said, listen, I know 100 people applied for this job, and out of this 100 people, only 20% of the people hired were Jewish. You know, out of 100% of people who applied, only 20% were Jewish. Then that's 4/5 of the Jewish people who applied. That's automatically discrimination, and the court will investigate. 4/5. So if 80% of one group got a promotion, got a benefit, got more money, got a job, got something, and 20% of the people who got that were from another group, a protected group, that is prima facie evidence of discrimination. So we talked before about disparate treatment and impact. I don't think we need to talk about that again. We could talk about it in class if you're unclear. We get our case from McDonnell Douglas, was the name of the case in 1973. This was a US employment case where it was a Title VII case. And they said you need to establish a prima facie case. You need to show the 4/5 rule. Then the employer immediately has the burden of proof. They have to prove some sort of non-discriminatory reason, which is either BFOQ or business necessity. And then the plaintiff, the employee, can present some sort of facts to show that there was probably discrimination. That's the McDonnell Douglas test. That's what we call that. So burden of proof, I said that under the 1991 law, the burden of proof now shifts to the company, which means the company has the responsibility to prove they didn't discriminate, which is much better for the employee. It's very hard to prove a company discriminated, but for the company, it's a lot better if I don't have to prove it, the company has to prove they didn't discriminate. So we've talked about business necessity, we've talked about BFOQ. Here's a little review of that we can go through again in class. But the idea that necessity is about purpose. Let's say that I make a dance club. Okay, I'm the owner of a dance club. And I hire sexy girls and sexy guys to dance. On the stage, I have these poles, I have cages, and I hire people to dance in the dance club. And recently, a 72-year-old grandmother came in who said, you know, she would like a job dancing. Can she dance? Maybe. She could grab the pole and sort of move around, maybe. But if I hire a bunch of old women and old men to dance in my club, nobody's going to come to my club. Well, nobody I want is going to come to my club. I have a business necessity. Am I discriminating against this old woman? Of course I am. That's absolutely age discrimination. What if I just want to hire women? Can I discriminate against men? Sure. What if it's a gay club? Of course I can discriminate against women and not hire them to dance in a gay club. Sure. Because I have a business purpose, and my purpose is not served by hiring these people. That's different than the BFOQ idea, which is, can they do the job? Can an old woman dance? Maybe. Can a woman dance in a gay club? Sure, she can. Can I hand out towels in a women's bathroom? I can, but I shouldn't. So BFOQ is this quality that says, can you do the job? So examples we have for BFOQ, things like a bus driver or an airplane pilot with mandatory retirement ages. What about somebody who's 80 years old? Can they drive a bus? Maybe they can't. If they failed their eye test or they're just getting too old, they can't. Hiring male models for men's clothing, of course. A woman cannot. And you could argue this point today in the environment of inclusivity and say anybody could do anything. But right now in the law, it is still acceptable to say we sell men's suits. We only hire men to wear those suits and be models. The idea of a religious school. Now, this is interesting. We can discuss this in class. Is this a necessity or a qualification? And my example before, I said, could I teach law in a Christian school? I could. But could I teach something I don't believe passionately? I don't know. I don't really believe some of the things that are in the Bible. Could I teach that as fact? I don't know. And it might be a real qualification they have that you actually really need to believe this stuff with your whole heart. And look, everybody questions and doubts when we talk about religion, but you have to believe this and have faith, or else you shouldn't be teaching in that environment, right? And then I talked about actors also. Okay, here's an activity we'll do in class. Now, the last part of today's lecture is to talk about sexual harassment. So a little bit about that. We can have a discussion in class. So Title IV was the first law that really talked about sexual harassment, because this was a bit, you can't discriminate against gender. You can't discriminate against anything, pretty much, in Title IV. So that was where this idea first came out, this idea of sexual harassment. And that includes making bad jokes, vulgar language, gestures, that means, hand gestures, slurs, using bad words, innuendos, which means using a word that doesn't mean anything sexual but kind of sounds sexual. Suggestive comment, which is where you say something and you're not really saying anything, but you're kind of suggesting something. If I said to a guy friend, I said, so, what'd you do last night? I'm suggesting something. Physical contact, leering means looking at someone, just staring at them. Stalking means following someone. Sexual pictures, writing on the wall, graffiti, any of these things could be harassment. And over time, we've gotten a more clear idea. So here's our definition right now. It is unwelcome sexual advances. It could be a request for sexual favors. It could be verbal. It could be physical. Any sort of conduct of a sexual nature. And there are three conditions. One, if it happened on the job. So if I sexually harassed somebody on the job, whether it's another employee or whether I'm a teacher and it's a student, doesn't matter. Or whether it's about employment decisions, where it's not on the job just yet, it's more about, are you going to give someone the job? And this was an important change in the law, because prior to this, imagine that I have an English teaching school and somebody applies for a job and I say, well, I'll give you the job on one condition, that you promise to come home with me tonight. Well, they originally would say, oh my God, David sexually harassed me. But according to Title VII, they don't work for me yet. So I could say, well, hey, it's not sexual harassment and we're just two private people. But now, thankfully, that has changed. So even if it's just about getting a job, you can't be sexual with someone. As long as it's unwelcome. I mean, that is a key word here. Just because somebody is sexual doesn't mean it's not welcome. That's terrible advice. I take that back completely. Don't do sexual harassment at work, whether you think it's welcome or not. It's not welcome. And the other one is unreasonable interference. Right? Anything that in any way interferes with somebody at work. Examples of this are things like submission, where this is a condition of employment, where you say to somebody, You know, I'll give you a job if you submit, if you come home with me, you go out with me. It doesn't have to be purely related to sex. It could be if you go on a date with me. That's still sexual harassment. You know, if I say, if you dress sexy, I'll give you a job if you promise to wear high heels. No. You know, that's submission to my sort of harassing comment as a condition for getting the job. I can't tell you. Now, I can have a uniform at work. I can say women must wear long sleeves or everybody has to dress professionally, but I cannot say like show your stomach or wear a crop top, or that's the same thing, or, you know, whatever. I can't, you know, I can't tell a woman how to dress, or a man for that matter. That's submission. Same for employment decisions, or, as I said, if there's any sort of interference with work performance, anything, and this is really important because this became a part of the law, these words, a hostile or intimidating, hostile, or offensive work environment. So let's say, for example, that you get a job at CIP, okay? You're a teacher at CIP, and you come into the teacher's room, and or maybe even you're just a student at CIP, and you come into my office, and on my desk, I have a bunch of, you know, photographs of sexy models that are either, you know, wearing bathing suits, or, you know, maybe they're not totally undressed, but they're sexy. These are not my friends or anything. These are just kind of, you know, soft, dirty pictures that I have at my desk. Could that be offensive to you? Sure. Could that be intimidating? Sure. It's very hostile in a lot of ways for a man to have these uncomfortable images around his desk, and then for you to walk over and see all of this stuff, because it kind of means that this is an objectification of women, that the man is looking at women as an object, and then you come over and is kind of looking at you as an object, and that's very hostile. That's very offensive, and that is more than enough for sexual harassment. Okay, it does not need to. He doesn't need to say, or if it's me at work, nobody needs to say a word. Nobody needs to touch you. Nobody needs to say you look good or bad, or talk about how you're dressed, or make a comment about how you spend your time. It could simply be the environment of the office. That could be harassment. So harassment doesn't need to be an action. It is environmental. It's a violation of Title VII as long as it interferes with work in any way. Under EEOC, employers have a responsibility to maintain a workplace that is free from sexual harassment. And that does mean you cannot have posters or pictures on the wall that are overly sexualized. And I think there's some interesting discussions to be had here about advertising companies, because a lot of them do use sex and femininity to sell things. What if you work in Victoria's Secret and on the walls are all these pictures of women who are wearing lingerie and negligees, you know, with the angel wings, and it's all very sexual? And is that sexual harassment? Well, I think they would argue business necessity. What they do is they sell, I don't know what you'd call it, lingerie, I guess. They sell lingerie to women. Obviously, their models are modeling the clothes that they sell. So it's a necessity. If you can't handle that, maybe you shouldn't work there. But there's interesting questions here about when does an environment become hostile. Under the Civil Rights Act of 1991, there again can be compensatory damages and punitive damages. So it is possible. Sexual assault can cost a business a lot of money, just a tremendous amount of money. It's a very dangerous thing in HR. If somebody comes to the HR department and wants to make a claim that they have been sexually harassed, it is very serious. It is something we really take seriously in HR. If for no other reason, then this can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars for the company. Of course, we want to do the right thing, but we work for the company, and this can cost us pretty much everything. So generally, there are two heads, we would call it, two ways to sue for sexual harassment. One is called quid pro quo and one is called hostile environment. This is what the woman, and it doesn't have to be a woman, it could be a man who's being harassed by other men or by women. But I'll just take the case of a woman being harassed by a man, as that's far more common. So quid pro quo means you do this for me, I'll do this for you, right? You go on a date with me, I'll give you the job. You go home with me, I'll give you the promotion. That's, I do this for you, you do this for me. That's called quid pro quo. Hostile environment is anything else where there's some sort of tangible consequence. Okay, a tangible consequence is something that's real. So let's say I have a picture on my desk and the picture is of my wife, and my wife has like whatever, a sexy dress on, and you go to HR and you complain that this is sexual harassment because it's offensive to you. There's no tangible consequence. Like, I'm sorry, I have this picture of my wife in a sexy dress, but this is not inappropriate, even though someone may be negatively impacted by that. It's really no different than me having a picture of my son with big muscles on my desk, and I come over and I feel, or somebody else comes over and they feel that their body is weak, and looking at this picture makes them feel bad. I mean, yes, sometimes things make us feel bad. It's not always harassment. It has to be some sort of tangible consequence or make the workplace very unreasonable. So these, and you need to know these. I guarantee you this will be on the test. Quid pro quo versus hostile environment. Employers are responsible if this is committed by a manager. Employers may be responsible if this is committed by an employee. Employers may be responsible if this is even committed by a customer. So imagine that I have a store and I'm the owner of this store. Now, if I have a manager and my manager is harassing the workers, I'm responsible. Okay? Now, what if the workers are harassing other workers? I'm probably responsible. Now, what if a customer, let's say a vendor first, what if a vendor comes into my store? My store sells books, okay, books and newspapers. And we have a company that comes in and delivers the books, and the delivery man or the delivery person harasses one of my employees. I might be responsible. What about if a customer who I don't even know comes in? Well, if I don't know them, I'm not responsible. That's not my fault. But if I knew or should have known, what if the same customer comes in every day at 10 o'clock a.m. to buy a newspaper every day, and this customer is always a little bit offensive to the workers, comes in and calls one of the women, sexy, or says like, oh, you're so pretty, or whatever, something that makes her uncomfortable. And she has come to me and said, David, this makes me very uncomfortable. I feel harassed. I really don't like it. It makes me feel bad. It makes me feel objectified. It makes me feel unsafe. And I know that she feels that way. And I fail to take action. I fail to do anything about it. I'm responsible. So if I knew or should have known that one of my workers was being harassed and I don't do anything about it, I'm responsible no matter who did it. In this kind of quid pro quo case, it doesn't need to be something tangible necessarily if it's quid pro quo. Again, quid pro quo is I do something for you, you do something for me. All the employer, and now the employer can defend. All you need to say if you're the employee is I felt that I was harassed. That's all you need to say. Now I need to defend myself, and I would have to show that I exercised care to prevent and correct this behavior, or that you failed to take advantage of a preventative or corrective opportunity. So let's say that and this is what a lot of businesses do now, is they'll say on the day you're hired, so welcome to my bookstore. You are the new employee at my bookstore. And just so you know, if you ever feel harassed, you can come to me in my office and we can talk about it. The procedure is you fill out a form and you then give the form to the HR department. They will give it to me and I'll schedule an appointment with you. Now, what if you come to my job and you feel harassed? If you don't fill out the form, you don't give it to HR, and you don't meet me, not my fault. I created an opportunity for you to try to deal with this, to correct this sexual harassment. You don't want to take my opportunity and fill out the form and give it to HR? You know, now you call me and you say, David, I can't come to work. It's a terrible environment. It's very hostile and offensive. I'm not coming in and I'm going to sue you. My defense would be, hey, we had a procedure. You chose not to follow the procedure. That's your choice. So there is a defense here for employers. What can an employee do? So you can always file a complaint with the person who harassed you, with the person who harassed you's boss. If you don't want to, you can always go to HR. And if that doesn't work, you can always go to the EEOC. The last thing to talk about here, really the last topic, we'll talk for a moment about what employers can do in recruitment. You know, we talked about word of mouth. You can't use misleading information. You can't discriminate. I think, with selection standards, it's okay to have education standards, but only if it's necessary. This is something that was very common in some of the cases that we'll talk about in our tutorial. This idea of a company saying, you know, if you want to get promoted at our, let's say we're a construction company, you must have a university degree. Why? You know, and then you'd have all these people who didn't get promoted, primarily in the case we'll be talking about, primarily black people who didn't get the promotion and they didn't have a university degree, and they sued and said, how is this related to the job? I've worked here for 5 years, I've done construction, I know the job, I'd be a good manager. Why do I need a university degree? So only if it's necessary. We can give tests, which we're going to learn about later in the semester, but it's got to be job related. You cannot give preference to relatives, that should be clear. Health questions are generally not allowed, you know, unless they're related to the job. You can't ask about arrests unless it's related to the job. You know, so you can't ask about felonies. But the last thing I really wanted to talk about was this idea of negligent hiring and retention. And that happens when a company fails to exercise reasonable care in hiring or retaining employees. What that means is, let's say that I have a company and I hire someone who's not really qualified. So I hire someone to be a warehouse employee, and they move boxes around, they drive the truck, and there have been a bunch of complaints about this person, that this person is doesn't show up, that they show up drunk, that they're careless, that they leave boxes around, and I don't fire them. Now, a lot of times this might be because they're a friend of the family, or I know them, there's some reason I didn't fire them, but for whatever reason I knew that there were complaints, but I didn't fire them. And you got hurt by them. They drove the truck into you, they dropped a box on you, they talked badly to one of your customers, and then the customer complained about you. Something happened where this person caused you harm. And this person has complaints about them, but I never did anything. In that case, you need to show that the person who caused you harm was not fit for hiring or for rehiring. They shouldn't have stayed here. That the reason you got hurt was because of this person, and that I knew or should have known, again, that language, should have known, that the employee was unfit. Now, what if this employee was unfit? They work in the warehouse, they're always dropping boxes, they're crashing things with the truck, but I'm the owner and nobody told me. They tell the manager, and the manager deals with it. Nobody ever told me. And then you get hurt by this person who drops a box on you. You go to the hospital and you want to sue me, the owner, because I have a lot of money. Should I have known? Yeah. It's my manager's fault for not telling me that there's a guy who works in my warehouse and people are complaining about him and he's not getting fired. I should have known that, right? This is my company. Now, maybe Jeff Bezos doesn't need to know what every single warehouse employee is doing, but there are levels of management that really should know. Okay, the deciding factor is really, can you establish that I exercised care with this person, reasonable care? So what is reasonable care? Did I test this person before I gave them a job? Did I check their references? Did I investigate gaps in their employment history? Did I check their school? Did I do a criminal investigation into them? Did I check their credit? Did I check their driving records? If I hired someone and I didn't check these things, that's careless. And I am responsible if they have a bad record for some reason, and I shouldn't have hired them. I should have known better. Okay, I think that's all we'll talk about. We're almost at 90 minutes. That's a little bit long, but it's a big topic. And if you have any questions, please keep them written down, save them for class. If there's something else, you can feel free to email or WeChat, but I'm pretty busy, so always give me 24 to 48 hour turnaround time. And I will see you in class. Take care.